me hit record. Welcome everyone to our October UPCA webinar. Super excited for everyone to be here. Just a reminder for those of you guys that weren't on here earlier, we do have the dates booked out for the Bryce Canyon Coalition Summit. So save the date for June 12th through the 14th in Bryce Canyon, Ruby's Inn. It's going to be awesome. And we'll give you more information as we get that information. But just feel free to jot that down in your calendars. And then if you have a moment, please hop on the chat and click the attendance document link that Taylor just put in there. And mark if you were in attendance, obviously. Before we turn the time over to Logan to talk to us about the importance of community readiness assessments, especially when it comes to our...
No.
Hey guys, will you make sure to mute your yourself? Okay, I can do it myself. Haha, I have the power. Okay. I was talking about the importance of community readiness assessments, especially when it comes to this new opioid settlement funding that many of us are receiving in our local LSAAs. One of the short-term outcomes that we promised is that we were going to increase the number of coalitions conducting community readiness assessments related specifically to opioids. So very important. But before we turn the time over to Logan, I just want to introduce Susanna, who is our UPCA policy chair, to update us on some policy here in Utah. So take it away, Susanna.
Thank you so much, Heidi. And thank you for letting me have a few minutes. As you know, it's only October, but the legislative session that is in 2024 in January is in full swing. I know that sounds odd, but it really is happening. And one of the things that I'm going to have send out to probably Taylor or someone to send out to the entire group is a letter that we're encouraging you all to send. You get to choose. It's educating and advocating for good policy related to alcohol in our communities. One of the issues that's coming up in this legislative session is, again, the omnibus bill, which is this one bill that includes all of the policy related to alcohol. And a couple of things that are really key right now is they want to change the proximity and allow variances. What does that mean? That means that where an establishment can serve alcohol has a maximum proximity related to some community spaces. So it cannot be within 600 yards or 300 yards, depending on what, like if it's a park or a school or a church, okay? And the deal that was made was that we, the community, would no longer, we would decrease it from, I think it was like 1,000 yards down to the 600, as long as they no longer allowed variances. They're looking to allow variances again. So there is a letter that I'm drafting. I'm having a couple of people look at it, but here's the key. When it goes out, we need you guys to send it to the mass email that I have. Can I show you real quick on my page here? I'm going to show you just real quick.
We have a phrase.
So right here, you'll see I have all, these are all the people that we're sending it to. And then this is the list. So you can just cut and paste. So you can put it right into your email, and then you need to find your own representatives because I won't know everyone's representatives. But making sure that it's sent out by next week. And I know that sounds urgent because it kind of is. There's another few things they're changing, looking to change the ability to move alcohol within a hotel. That's, we call it mobility. So instead of just drinking at the hotel bar, currently you can't take it out of the hotel bar. They want you to be able to do that. So if any of you been to Vegas, pretend there's no casinos, but like you're in the hotel and walking around with those lovely tall drinks or your lovely Long Island iced teas or whatever you're drinking in a space that's for everybody. And it changes, again, the culture. And that's what we're looking to do it. And we want to keep it very simple. Enough is enough. We will not have anything left to protect the youth in our community if we continue to erode these current policies. So there are going to be other things that are coming up, but this is the one that's a little more time sensitive. We're also going to be working on things, not just alcohol, but also things related to vape and nicotine. So really, we're going to be pushing hard this year to be very involved and energetic. And here's my push. If only 2 people from every coalition send a letter, 2 people, and there's a roughly 60 coalitions in the state, even if we went to 50, that means that we'd have 100 letters sent or emails sent to these legislators. That would be phenomenal. I think we should have more, but at least that many, and send it from your personal, not your work. Do not send it from a work email, please. And this is advocacy, and we're asking very, very clearly, this is what we're doing. Okay. Any questions real quick? And I'm going to turn it back over to Logan. Thank you.
All right, am I up, Heidi? You want me to just jump in?
Yes, you're up. Sorry for no formal introduction. Hopefully everybody knows Logan. He's the director, the regional director of prevention services for the Southwest area, and pretty much an expert on community readiness assessments. So when the UPCA exec committee was kind of brainstorming on who would be good to present this information to us, as it often does, Logan's name came up, and he was gracious enough to be willing to spend an hour of his time to present this information. So thank you, Logan.
I'm very happy to do this. I mean, as anybody who knows me probably can attest, community readiness assessments is one of my favorite things in prevention. And one of those reasons is because I think it has such a positive impact on effectiveness, on being effective in our prevention work. I don't know if I would classify myself as an expert on it. I'm sure that we do have a lot of experts on the call. And so, feel free as I'm going through this to be sharing your own thoughts and experiences. Maybe we can use the chat for that. Also, if you have questions, throw them in there. I have a lot of information that I'm going to try to move through pretty quickly, but I'm happy to slow down if I need to, or maybe we can put together some responses to questions if we run out of time. And so put your questions in the chat, and if we don't get to them now, I'll make sure that I do get a response to you. I want to start. I know there's probably people on the call who have seen me give a version of this presentation that I'm going to go through. I was asked by CADCA years ago to come and do a presentation at their mid-year conference on community readiness assessments. And then I've taken a version of that I teach in our SAPS classes. And so I was going through those slides and trying to decide which of them I could eliminate to narrow this down into a 45-minute presentation. And I had a hard time with that, but I have taken some things out, and I'm going to try to make this maybe a quick course on community readiness assessments, but there's still a lot of information. And so I'm going to go through as much of that as I can and do it quickly. And I wanted to start with why I think community readiness assessments are important. I'm guessing that most of us, especially if we've worked with coalitions, but if we've worked with any sort of a committee or a task force before, we've probably had this experience where we came up with great ideas, but when we actually implemented them, they didn't turn out the way that we wanted them to. And I know that this has happened to me many times. It continues to happen to me where I think that I put the cart before the horse a little bit, and I maybe haven't thought really about all of the things that I needed to in order for my strategy to be successful. And that's the primary reason why I really like community readiness assessments, because they're designed to prevent us from doing that. They're designed to have us decide how ready our community is to actually do something about an issue that we're concerned about. And if they're not ready, building their readiness, getting them ready for those services. So when we talk about community readiness assessments, I want to just quickly describe what they are, how you do them, and then we can talk a little bit about how this applies to improving the effectiveness of our prevention services, making them more effective. And so I want to talk a little bit about real world application and how we can use these. So I'm going to come back to this definition. Don't worry about it too much yet, but I wanted to throw it up on the screen here right at the beginning so you can start to think about the definition. Simply put, community readiness is how ready, willing, and prepared your community is to take action on an issue. If you studied psychology or sociology or public health at some point, I'm guessing you were probably introduced to Prochaska and DiClemente. In 1992, they published research on a theory that they had been working on that they called the trans-theoretical model of behavior change. Most people have come to call the stages of change model. When they first developed this, they were creating it for therapists, for counselors who were working with individuals one-on-one. And what they proposed was that if you really want to help someone deal with an issue that they're struggling with, you have to figure out what stage their behavior is in. And then, based on that stage, you can use specific techniques for helping them make progress toward their goals. And I think most of us, like counselors being introduced to Prochaska's model, probably see the logic in this approach. I'm guessing that many of us have done presentations or we've taught classes in our tenure in prevention where maybe we didn't do this very effectively. I often tell a story about when I was teaching nicotine dependence classes and how I would have youth who were coming into those classes who felt like they didn't really have a problem. They didn't feel like they were addicted, even though they were using a lot of tobacco on a very regular basis. And I would often hear comments about how my family has a higher tolerance and I'm young. I'm not planning on doing this forever. I'm just going to do it for a little while. And then I'll stop when I get a little bit older. And it's probably not going to have as much of a negative impact on me because of my family history. I know that we've all probably heard stories similar to this with people that we're working for. And the example that I often give is how effective am I going to be if I have an adolescent that I'm working with like that, who does not think that they have a problem. They don't think that there's anything wrong with their use. And my plan is to just jump right into a quit plan with them. And what I usually suggest is that that's not going to be very effective. A quit plan is not going to help them because they're not interested in quitting. They don't think that they have any issues. So me trying to help them identify their triggers and set up a plan is not really going to be effective. I've got to really back up and get them to start thinking about why it might be important for them to quit. Get them to start thinking about maybe the harms that are resulting from their use. And eventually I can work my way toward a quit plan. Well, after Prochaska and DiClemente created this model, it was kind of this breakthrough perspective for a lot of people that were working individually with clients. And they realized, yeah, we've got to slow down and work people toward an action stage. And it wasn't long after that that public health officials started wondering if we could expand this from individual level change into community level change. What if we moved it into the realm of public health so that rather than just using it for individual or group counseling, we moved it to the entire community. And I have a friend who did research for this on when he was working on his master's degree. And he was using Prochaska and DiClemente's model, but looking at how it could be expanded into the field of public health. He was looking at why men over 50 don't get cancer screenings. And there's actually quite a bit of debate about regular screenings for these cancers and whether or not they really are helpful. And there are some studies that show that they may not be. Other studies show that there could be benefits to early detection by doing these screenings. The problem is that men don't do them. They tend not to do or to get early screenings for specifically things like prostate or colorectal cancer. Lots of health agencies have tried to change this, but in a lot of cases they failed. And the reason is because we typically try to jump straight to step 4. We jump straight to action. We do community lectures. We put up billboards. We hand out pamphlets telling men over 50 that they should get a prostate exam. But they often forget one important factor, which is that men are not typically worried about prostate cancer. Men, even if they are worried about it, may not be contemplating getting an exam, let alone planning on getting one, because most men don't really want the evasiveness of that kind of an exam. So just telling them to do it doesn't change their behavior. So this friend of mine, Dr. Lucas, was conducting research to see if he could apply the behavior change model to this particular issue and improve men's likelihood of getting an exam. So instead of telling men to get an exam, they created pamphlets and billboards that were designed to increase contemplation. They were just information about prostate cancer. They ran those ads for a series of months. Then they put up billboards and pamphlets that were designed to help men create a plan to schedule an exam. At the conclusion of the project, they found that the number of men coming in to get exams had more than tripled. And I'm just sharing this as an example of how the behavior change model could be applied not just at an individual level, but toward community level change. Rather than just telling someone to do something, what if we work on increasing their contemplation and their planning to do that something? And it was with that same idea that researchers have worked to establish methods to help us do this. And that's what community readiness is about. How do we get a community to start thinking about and planning to create change? And I like to point out that there are many different types of models for doing this, and they're not mutually exclusive. Just because you use one doesn't mean that you can't also use others. For example, I have some listed on the screen here. I really like the Community Key Leader Survey that was created by Goodman and Wandersman. I think it's an excellent tool to pair with any other model that you're using. So I just want to point out, just because you used one doesn't mean that you can't use others. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to focus on just one model today. And the reason I'm going to focus on this one is that, first of all, a lot of us are probably familiar with it. Second of all, it really is my favorite. It's my favorite of all of these models for a couple of reasons, and I'll talk about those. But I'm going to focus on Colorado State University's community readiness model. We often refer to it as the Triethnic Centers model because it's the Triethnic Center at Colorado State University that developed this. They've been researching and doing community assessments for the last 2 decades. They've developed a community readiness assessment that is designed to assess a community's readiness to address an issue on these 5 key dimensions that you see on the screen here. And I just want to remind you again here of our definition of community readiness. How ready is a community to change? How ready are they to take action on an issue? Are they ready to start addressing underage drinking or tobacco use or whatever prevention priority you have identified? Because if they aren't, if we start holding town halls on that subject, nobody's going to show up to them. If they don't feel it's important, if they're not ready to start addressing them, our efforts are not going to be effective. And we're going to end up getting mad because what we're doing isn't working. And I'm just speaking from experience of the times that I've gotten frustrated that my community didn't jump at a strategy the way that I thought they would, and then eventually realized it was because they weren't ready, and I didn't assess that, and I didn't develop their readiness before jumping into those strategies. So the Triethnic Centers model is designed to assess a community's readiness to change or to address an issue. And they focus on these 5 key dimensions, which is one of the reasons that I like the model. They look at the community's knowledge of the issue. Do they even know that there is a problem with youth that are vaping? Do they know what we mean when we talk about prescription drug misuse or abuse? Have they ever heard of that issue? They also look at community knowledge of efforts. Maybe they've heard of it, but do they know that there is a coalition that is addressing it? Do they know that there are entities trying to change it? Do they know of other resources in the community that are trying to address this issue? Third, what's the climate of the community? In other words, what is their attitude toward the issue? Maybe they know about it. Maybe they know about the local prevention specialists and their attempts to change it, but do they care? Are they interested? Is it important to them? Fourth, what about the leaders? Is it important to the leaders? Does the superintendent or the mayor care? Does the city council care about this issue? Do teachers or principals care about it? If they're the ones that are going to have an influence on the rest of the community, then we need to understand what leadership thinks about this. And then finally, what resources do we have to actually make change? Are we ready to implement a program or a strategy? Do we have the infrastructure in place? Do we have the funding? Are there others in the community who can help us? By considering each of these 5 issues, I think that we get a lot closer to actually being able to implement legitimate prevention tactics with the capacity to improve or prevent the problems that we are trying to tackle. Let me quickly give you a little bit more background on the Triethnic Center's community readiness model. It was first developed by that group of researchers that I mentioned at Colorado State University back in 1995. And they were specifically trying to target community level change with substance abuse and HIV and AIDS. And so they used Prochaska and DiClemente's model of personal stages of change, but they applied it to work that was done by Dr. Warren clear back in 1978 on social action. And the result was a model that they published. And then Dr. Linda R. Stanley revised it a few years ago, and it is available for free online. That I know that if you see the image on the screen here, that's showing you a handbook that the Triethnic Center has developed that will walk you through all of the steps for how to do these community readiness assessments. The link that you see there is a link to their page where you can access that document. I'm also going to drop it into the chat box at the end of the presentation, so you'll be able to link directly to that handbook. And I just wanted to stop here and just say, here's the answers to all of your questions about the Triethnic Center's version for a community readiness assessment. This is a really detailed handbook. It will give you links to sources from other research that has been done on this model, and it will give you all of the step-by-step details for how to go through and do this. The model's been tested and used extensively to address all sorts of community change issues. I listed some of them here on the screen, from drug use to HIV and AIDS to animal control, taxation. And that's one of the reasons that I like it, is that it's been used and tested to address a lot of different issues. I also like it because it is simple and it's easy for a coalition to implement. It's been researched a lot. It's been found to be effective. And also, one of the things that I like about it is there were some researchers who did a study on this particular model back in 2015. They looked at 40 different implementations of the model, and they concluded that one of the reasons that it's effective is because of its flexibility to accommodate diverse definitions of community and issues. This model is very flexible. In fact, one of the really interesting versions of the model is one that the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network created to assess community readiness for HIV interventions among Aboriginal populations in Canada. So they created a culturally competent version of the assessment for this very specific population and demographic. And so that's another reason that I like it, is that you can adapt this to your community. And it's something that's really simple. It's not, you don't need a PhD to implement this. Any coalition can easily do this assessment. You can involve all of your coalition members in it. So if you're looking for something to give members an easy assignment that they can accomplish and feel like they're a part of a coalition, this is, oh, did my presentation just stop?
Yeah.
This is a great way to do that. Let me just share it again. I'm not sure what happened there. All right, are you seeing it again now, Heidi?
Yep. Yep,
Okay.
it's back.
So this is just a great way to engage your coalition and help them feel involved. And my experience has been that coalitions really like doing these assessments. So I typically recommend that this would be the first thing that you have a new coalition do after you get them organized. And once again, it's research-based, it's simple, it works. So those are some of the reasons that I like this. As I finish up this first section where I said I wanted to explain what it is, I want to just give a really quick overview of the key components of the assessment, and then I'll come back and we'll go into a little bit more detail. We'll walk through some examples and hopefully explain this really well. But to start with, this is the basic overview of this assessment model. It starts with a set of survey questions about an issue, whether that is substance use or AIDS or obesity or alcohol tax or whatever it might be. You're going to have a survey that asks about attitudes, beliefs, and knowledge of this one specific issue. Then you're going to do a small number of interviews where you ask those questions. And I emphasize a small number. This is not an assessment that you're trying to get published in a peer-reviewed A-list journal. You don't have to have 1,000 responses before your data can be considered accurate. Their research has shown you only need 6 to 12 interviews, depending on your community and depending on the issue that you're looking at. So you're going to do a small number of interviews. Next, you'll score the interviews using a scale that they provide to you. Then using those scales, you'll calculate a readiness score. And once you've done that, you use those scores to develop a plan. So that's a really basic overview. Like I said, we'll go into more detail. So don't worry, if you have questions about each of these steps, we'll get into that. But I wanted to start with this overview. And I think the best thing about this assessment, this is my opinion, but one of the best things about this is that once you have a score of where your community is at in their readiness, this model gives you recommendations for what you should focus on. For example, let's say that your community is in stage 1, which is no awareness. They don't know that vaping among 6th graders is a problem in your community, for example. Rather than jump straight to a town hall, like I think we often do, like I've done many times, which is a strategy for a much more aware community, this model is going to recommend that I do one-on-one visits with community leaders. Rather than jumping to this big town hall meeting, I'm going to identify specific people in my community that I could start talking to about this issue one-on-one. The point that I want to make here is that this assessment will give you very specific things that you can focus on depending on the readiness level of your community. It will actually give you your action plan for what you should be doing. And one more thing that I love about this is that the higher your readiness level, the more ideas there are for action. Because if my community is in stage 3, there's going to be a whole other list of bullet points that I can focus on. But this model also stresses that I should continue with the recommendations from stage 1 and stage 2 as well. So the further you move through awareness, the more items that you get that you can start focusing on to impact your community. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what it is and how to do it. Like I've tried to say, this is really easy. It's a simple assessment. Any coalition can do it. I've done it with community safety coalitions. I've done it with suicide prevention coalitions. I've done it with a lot of drug prevention coalitions, both youth and adult. I've even done versions of it with specific populations. I've done a version of it with my own department, with our prevention employees here, to see how ready they might be to implement certain changes in our department. So there's a lot of different applications and ways that you can do this. I'm going to go through the steps that the University of Colorado gives, but I like to add one important step in before I get to those, which is if you're going to do this with your coalition, I think the first step is to explain this model to your coalition. You need to get their buy-in and support for doing an assessment like this, or it's not going to work. I'm speaking from experience here. So I like to dedicate an entire coalition meeting to the first few steps of this model. And I start with just a quick 15 to 20 minute overview of the community readiness model. I explain briefly what it is, why it's important. I give a couple examples, essentially what I've done right here at the beginning of this presentation. I like to do that for my coalition to start with, just so that they understand it and that they're bought in. Once I've done that, I can jump into the actual steps that the Tri-Ethnic Center has outlined. And the first step is to identify and define your issue. And I think it's important to remember that readiness is issue specific. Just because a community is ready to address youth tobacco use doesn't mean that they're ready to address underage drinking. Just because they're ready to address underage drinking doesn't mean that they're ready to address adult binge drinking. So a key step before doing anything else is to decide what the issue is that you want to assess and then clearly define it. When you say underage drinking, what do you mean? Are you talking about people 20 years old and under, or are you focused specifically on high school aged youth? Are you looking at 18 and under? And so you need to get specific with what your definitions are. I know a lot of adults that consider underage drinking as something that only applies to youth under 18. They're not as concerned about kids who are about people who are 19 or 20 that are consuming. So this is just an example of why it might be important to get specific and define what you're talking about. You also have to explain that to the people that you're interviewing. So I was doing interviews with a community to assess readiness for prevention of youth prescription drug use years ago. And I found that I had done a couple of these interviews, and then one interviewee thought that I was asking them about kids using their own prescription just as the doctor had prescribed them. So we were halfway through the interview, and I realized that they had a different definition of prescription drug misuse than I did. And so I had to explain to them and say, no, we're okay with somebody using a prescription drug as it was prescribed. I'm only asking you about kids using a prescription not as prescribed or one that's not theirs. And I thought that was really clear, but the interviewee was like, oh, I didn't know that's what you were asking me about. And so I realized I need to be a little bit more clear right up front about what I'm asking them about. When I say youth prescription drug abuse and misuse, I need to tell them I mean an adolescent using a prescription drug that is not theirs or taking more than prescribed. And this is all part of the first step. Identify an issue and define it. Maybe you have data showing that your 12th grade e-cig use rates are coming down rapidly, but your 8th grade e-cig use rates are climbing. You might want to narrow your issue even more. You want to specify that you're only focusing on 12 to 15-year-olds, for example. And that might be important because perhaps your community is less ready to address an issue with middle or junior high school kids compared to high school students. So just keep that in mind. The point that I'm trying to make here is that it is issue specific, and you can get really specific with the issues. This is the first step. If I'm working with a coalition, I like to do this with the whole coalition. So after I've explained what the readiness model is, I have them pick the issues that they want to address. And we do this all in a coalition meeting. So maybe you've already got data. Maybe you have your most recent SHARPS data, and you've used that to help decide what issues you want to focus in on. You might have to limit that even more. For every readiness assessment that you want to do, you're going to do a separate one for each of these issues. So you can't do one readiness assessment for how ready is my community to address youth substance use. That's too broad. You have to get very specific about the substance and maybe even the age group. And that means that very quickly you could be looking at a whole bunch of readiness assessments. And my experience is that if you get more than 2 to 4 of these, your coalitions start to get bogged down and they start to lose some of their focus and some of their effectiveness. So I try to keep it at 2 or 3. Just remember, readiness is issue specific. So whatever you decide to do, you're going to have to do a different assessment for each issue that you select. And that means separate interviews have to be conducted for each issue. Once your coalition or whatever group you're working with has picked their issues, like I said, I like to have them clearly define it. What do they mean when they say underage drinking or prescription drug use or youth depressive symptoms? So I have them create a statement for each issue that clearly defines it. And then I put that statement in the interview schedule, which I'll show you in just a minute. But that way, whoever's doing the interview has the statement right there, and they can read it to the interviewee so that everybody's on the same page and they're all clear about what we're talking about. The next step is similar to the first, but you're identifying and defining your community. And again, it's important to remember a community doesn't have to be a geographical area. That's usually a good place to start. I do recommend creating a geographical boundary like a city or a county or a school district. But I think that very often we can go a lot further than that. Is there a specific subgroup within your population that you want to focus on? Or maybe there's a specific organization. Like I mentioned, I've done this with my department. I've done this with law enforcement. We did a readiness assessment where we wanted to see how ready law enforcement officers were to start enforcing underage drinking laws. And so my target population was active law enforcement officers from local police departments. But that's all part of step 2, identifying your community, identifying the group that you're going to target. I like to do this step in that same meeting where I'm introducing the readiness assessments to the coalition, and I have them pick the issue and I have them define the community that they're going to survey. Depending on your coalition, that might take an entire meeting, which I think is okay. If that's the case, I complete those 3 things, and then the next meeting I move into step 3. But I also just wanted to mention here, I've been able to go through this whole thing in one coalition meeting before as well. So it kind of depends on the coalition and their engagement. But I'm just pointing out, you can do this whole process in 1 or 2 meetings with your coalitions. Now we're ready to create our interview questions, and you don't have to start from scratch. It's already created. They have a series of questions that you can just add your issue and your community into, and the question is ready to go. They actually have them listed by structure. So the ones in bold are the ones that you must ask if you want your assessment to be done with fidelity, according to their research. The research that shows that these are effective were ones where they used the questions that are written in bold. There are other questions that they're going to give you, other sample questions, and you can decide whether or not you want to use those. You can adjust them if you want. You can add in your own questions to the survey. You just want to make sure that you put those after the bold ones. But if you want to add more questions, you can. Also, this is where you can create an introductory statement to make sure that the respondents really understand what you're asking them about. And truthfully, I found that this is just as important for the interviewers. Sometimes everyone on your coalition might not be 100% clear on some of these things. So having a really good introductory statement is beneficial both for the interviewer and the person being interviewed. The Triethnic Center recommends always having at least 2 people create the interview questions, which I think is wise. Have 2 people so you have different perspectives. But what I think is really essential is that you pilot that survey with your coalition before you actually go out and start doing it. Once you have all the questions, you've created your introductory statement, you can divide all of your coalition members that are going to be doing this into partners. You could have them give the interview to each other. And what I've found is that by doing that, you're probably going to make your questions better. Like your coalition members that didn't help write the questions are going to be able to point out, this one doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I'm not sure what you're getting at. And so you'll tease out some of those things. And it also just gets everybody on the same page. They're really going to understand what you're doing if they've had a chance to kind of practice this themselves. You could also do this with just a couple of people. Maybe you want to assign a committee to create the questions and then bring them back and present them to the coalition. Maybe you want to take some time in a coalition meeting to go through the questions together and to have people help you create them. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. Personally, I like to assign a committee to do it. So after I've presented the overview of the model to them, we've identified our issue in our community, I then assign a committee to create the interview schedule and create an introductory script, and then they bring that back to the next coalition meeting to be approved by the coalition. And then we move into step 4, which is where you choose who you're going to interview. The whole idea of this assessment is to get a snapshot of the community. What does the community know about this issue? And to get a well-rounded picture, you need to have people from different sectors of the community. The Triethnic Center recommends having at least 6 different sectors represented, and you can see those 6 listed here on the screen. I'm sure a lot of you are also very familiar with the 12 sectors that SAMHSA and Drug Free Communities recommends, or if you remember the SPIFSIG grant many years ago, they required these same 12 sectors. That could be another good place to start. It includes the 6 that I just showed from Triethnic Center plus 6 more. In fact, when I do this, I've actually picked one person from each of these 12 sectors, and those were the 12 people that we interviewed for our readiness assessment. So that might be a way that you consider doing this. You don't have to do 12, like I said. Depending on your community and the issue, you can do as few as 6. I like to do 8 to 10 when I do these. But if you've got a larger community, or if you want more detail on the issue, you might decide to go for 12. You decide however many you want to interview, but just remember, you want to pick at least 6, and you want to bring them in from different sectors in your community. unless your issue doesn't require that. I mentioned that I did this with law enforcement officers one time. And if I'm only interested in how ready law enforcement officers are, I don't need to bring in teachers or media. And so in that case, I might focus on different sectors within law enforcement, like maybe people from patrol, administration, prosecution, etc. Once you've selected your sectors, you can start brainstorming actual people to go and interview. And the Tri-Ethnic Center has activity sheets that are in that workbook that I'm going to link to in just a minute. And they're really helpful. This is one of them that has you pick your sectors and then explain why you think the people from that sector might be important or good to have involved. So I think this is a good activity sheet to use if you have a data committee, for example, that's handling all of this. Rather than doing it during a full coalition meeting, you could have them go through this worksheet and then bring their results back. They have tables that you can use, which can be really helpful when you start actually writing down names and contact information. But I wanted to show you, sometimes if the venue allows it, this is how I like to do it. I actually create the table like on a whiteboard in a coalition meeting that looks something like this. And I'll have a column with respondent. That's the person that will be interviewed. And then I'll have a column for the coalition member that is going to do that interview. And then I'll have a due date by when they're going to have the interview done. And so I start out with something like this on the board, and I have the coalition just start listing names. So we might focus on something like civic leader. And I would say, tell me who are some civic leaders you can think of that might be good for us to interview. And I'll write down all of the names that they list. And we'll just go through this until we have our 8 or 10 or 12 sectors filled. And then I'll come back and we'll start talking about them specifically. And we'll say, okay, we really only need one civic leader. We've got 3 options up here. Who do we think would be best? And we'll have some discussion and some debate about that until we narrow it down to one person. And then we'll choose which coalition member is going to be the one to go and make contact with that person and do the interview. And we'll set a return date for when they're going to bring their results back to us. So I'm just showing you, here's an example of some different ways that you can do this and how you can actually do it as part of a coalition meeting if you would like to. Once you've decided on who you're going to interview, it's time to actually go out and conduct the interviews. You want to make sure that your coalition members, if they're going to be doing these interviews with you, actually schedule a time with the person. So set up an appointment. Interviews will probably take you about 30 minutes, maybe longer, 30 to 45 minutes. So you need to give people a chance to schedule it in advance. Plus, I think that makes it seem a little bit more official. The next big question is how to conduct the interview. And there are different, you could do a telephone interview, you could sit down with them face to face. The Tri-Ethnic Center has actually started recommending telephone interviews for a couple of reasons, but I wanted to briefly discuss the pros and cons of each of these. One of the reasons that they promote doing a telephone interview is because respondents are less likely to try and impress the interviewer when they're not looking at you face to face, which means they might be a little bit more honest. And part of that is because they can't see your face. They're not trying to read what your thoughts are about their comments. So you might get more honest responses over the phone. I think that's a good argument for why doing phone interviews can be good. On the other hand, respondents don't talk as much on the phone as they tend to when you're face to face with them. Plus, when you're face to face, you can read their facial features and their body language, which might give you some richer interpretation of what they're saying. It's up to you to decide. I think that the reason that the Tri-Ethnic Center recommends telephone interviews is because if you're engaging your coalition members, they may not have any experience with doing this. And it could be really easy for them to lead the respondent the way they're asking the questions, or by their reactions, maybe changing how responses are given. So I guess what I'm saying is that if you do decide to do face-to-face interviews, you need to provide some training to your coalition members, make sure that you stress with them that they need to be objective, they need to be neutral, remind them not to lead the respondents and give their own opinions. You don't want them going into lecture mode. They need to just ask the questions and take note of the responses. If it's possible, they recommend that you record these so that you can go back and you can transcribe them into more detail. I've done it multiple ways. I've done it without doing that, where I was actually taking notes as the one who was doing the interviewer. It worked. I don't think that my notes were as rich as they could have been. It was also less time intensive because we didn't have to go back and transcribe them. But like I said, I don't think we got as detailed as information as we could. I've also done this where we had two interviewers. So we had one person that was asking the questions and a second person that was just taking notes. So there's different ways that you can do this. My recommendation, though, is that you make sure that interviewers are familiar with the scoring, because that will make it so much easier for them to conduct the interview. So what I like to do is, before I send coalition members out to do these assessments, I have them do a practice interview, take notes, and then actually go through the scoring process and score those notes. So let me just show you some examples here. This is one that Pam Holliday, who is the coordinator for the Washington County Prevention Coalition, she sent me this morning, and this is a recent community readiness assessment that her coalition is working on with a specific cone site in their community. And this is a script that they created for their coalition members to use when they're doing the interviews. So you can see that they address marijuana use, they specify what that means, they describe the geography of the community that they're asking about, they get permission to record the interview. I think this is a fantastic example of how to do this, and how you can engage your coalition members to be a part of this and actually go out and be the ones that are doing these interviews. Here's an example of the questions. You can see that Pam just went in and added in the community and the specific substance that they were focusing on. And other than that, they didn't really have to change these questions. This also shows you the questions that are bold. Those are the ones that you need to make sure you do. The ones that aren't bold are optional, and the ones that you can change. So I just wanted to give you an example of some coalitions who right now are in the process of doing these readiness assessments, and let you see how they're going about doing that. I want to make sure that I quickly get through each of these steps. So step 6 is to score the interviews. They recommend that you have 2 people score each of the interviews independently. So they're going to take the notes, or they're going to take the recordings, and they're each going to go and listen to them and do their own scoring. Then once they've done that, you bring them back together and they compare their scores, and they decide on what they think. They come to a consensus about the scores. So if one of them had a 4 and one of them had a 6, maybe they decide that they're going to go with a 5, or they're going to discuss why they scored it a certain way, and they're going to agree on a specific shared score. And what you end up with is something like this, a table that shows each of the different topics of the interview, and then it will have a score for each of the questions, or for each of the interviewers, interviewees that you interviewed. So here's an example. The 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 up there at the top, those are each a person that was interviewed, and then you can see the score that they were given for each of these sections of the community readiness assessment. And then all you do is average out those scores, and then average your averages, and it will give you a readiness score. So this is a community that I did a readiness assessment for many years ago, and you can see that their overall score was a 3. This one was on youth prescription drug use. I also this is an example from Brianne Veeder, who is the coordinator for the Parowan Coalition. She sent me an example. You can see their handwritten scores from the interviewers, and afterwards they went through and they scored the sheets, and it ended up looking like this. And they then brought all of those together and got an average that gave them where their community was at as far as readiness. There are a total of 9 levels of readiness, from no awareness all the way up to community ownership, meaning the community knows about it, they're supportive of changing it, and you have the resources to change it. So when you do the interviews and score them, it's going to tell you what stage of readiness your community is in, and then give you suggestions for how to start increasing that readiness. Step 7, and I think this one is really important, is to actually use the data. And I say this is so important because the very first time I did readiness assessments, I didn't really use the data. Like I went back and told the coalition, our community scored a 3, and we talked about it a little bit, and then we just went on, and we didn't actually use the data to help us. So I think this is really important. Write up a report, take it back to your coalition, take it to other places. If you let your media know that you've just done a community readiness assessment for your community on how ready they are to address a particular issue, your media is probably going to be interested in that. They might want to do a story on it. They might want to publish your results and come and interview you. I've done this before where I shared it with mayors, and the mayor then said, I want the city council to see this. Would you come and show these results to the city council? Think about how you can actually use this data. And in fact, I want to just jump down really quick and show you an example of some reports that I've created with this. This is one of the first reports I ever created way back in 2010 after doing community readiness assessments. And we explained what they were on this report and then gave specific details about what we learned from the readiness assessments. This is one that I got this morning from Teresa Willie with her Reach for Hope coalition. And she shared this report that they did last year on their readiness assessments. And you'll see that they actually listed some of the strategies that the assessments suggested that they should focus on based on their level of readiness. And she also shared some specific examples of responses that they got while doing the interviews, which I think is a great idea. Actually let people see what people were saying about this information. So I think it's really important to use the information. It will tell you what stage of awareness or what stage of readiness your community is in. And based on that stage, it will give you a bullet point list of things like this that you can do to increase readiness, to raise the readiness. And then you can actually use this data. And there's a lot of different ways that you can use it. I want to share one more example here. This is an excerpt from one of the most recent drug-free community application grants that Melissa Vader sent in. I think this was just last year for one of their community's year 6 grants. And I just wanted to show you how she actually used in her application an example of their readiness assessments as evidence for impact in their community. So she pointed out how one of the questions in the survey is, do you know about resources that are available in the community for preventing substance use? And she pointed out that the very first time they did these readiness assessments in 2012, nobody knew of any resources. By 2015, when the coalition did these readiness assessments, people were naming the coalition. They were saying, yeah, we actually have a drug prevention coalition here. By 2019, almost everybody they interviewed listed the community coalition as one of the local resources. So this is a great example to show different ways that you can use the data to demonstrate impact that you're having in your community. I have a lot of other things that I could talk about, but we've only got a little bit of time. Let me just give you a quick example. The very first time that I did this, clear back in 2009, we were concerned about prescription drug misuse in our community. And we were looking at data like this that was showing that ER visits for prescription narcotic overdose were increasing rapidly in our communities, that a significant number of those were youth. We had new data from Sharps showing that prescription drug misuse had not been an issue in previous years, but now it was leading up to 2007. And so we decided to focus on prescription drug misuse. We did readiness assessments, and those readiness assessments indicated that our community was in denial or resistance. They didn't view this as being a problem, which means if I jump straight to a town hall meeting, nobody's going to come to that. The community didn't view this as being a concern. And I know that's the case because the coalition was still adamant that we do a town hall meeting. And I said, but we have this readiness assessment data that shows that we're not ready for that. And they said, no, we still want to do it. And so we spent 3 months. We planned this huge town hall. We did all of this advertising, really went out of our way to try to get a lot of people there. We ended up with our 13 coalition members and 6 community members. And the 6 community members were 6 of the people that we had done the readiness assessments with. And because we did the readiness assessment with them, they were now interested in the topic. And so they came to the town hall meeting. And those were the only ones that were there. So then the coalition was like, okay, maybe we should go back to the recommendations and do what they recommend. And we were in level 2. And so these were our recommendations. One of the things that was recommended is that we use media to start helping the community see that there is an issue. We actually had a grant that would allow us to do some media, and we had a really good relationship with our local billboard company. And so they gave us a really good deal. And we did a bunch of billboards in the community. They ran for 6 to 18 months. I'm not suggesting that this is a strategy for you to do. I'm only giving this as an example of how we used the model. The model said, distribute media that highlights the issue in your community. So this is one of the things that we did. It also said that we should do one-on-one visits with community leaders. So we went to our mayor, we presented the results to him. He asked us if we would come to the city council and present it to them. We did that. They then asked if we would come and present it to some of their groups. And so it turned into a whole bunch of small group presentations. We got a meeting with our local interfaith council, a group of religious leaders from 26 different congregations in our community. They meet once a month to share information. And I love this picture. This is a picture of Dr. Ben Irwin, who at the time was the chair of our data committee. And he is presenting the results of our readiness assessment to this group of religious leaders. And he's showing them how the recommendation was that we do educational outreach to different key leaders in the community. And that's why we had come to talk to them as religious leaders. And this actually turned into a whole bunch of them saying, hey, would you come and talk about this issue with our congregation? And hopefully you can see how much more effective this is than us just doing a town hall meeting where nobody comes. Now we've got religious leaders that are inviting us to come and present to their parishioners in their specific congregations. And this turned into a whole big project where we eventually had so many of these that we had to create a curriculum that we could give to the leaders so that they could start doing it themselves because we didn't have enough coalition members to fulfill the need. The point of all of this is that if you actually do these readiness assessments, it will tell you what you should be doing. It will give you a readiness level, and you can then track that over time. So this is another example of one of Teresa Willey's coalitions, and you can see where they were at the very first time they did a readiness assessment and how they're tracking this over time. And they're actually able to show that their community's readiness is going up because they're doing what the model says they should do. They're actually following those recommendations. So I'm out of time. Hopefully what I've tried to do here, and I know that I went really fast, but I tried to give you some of the background on these readiness assessments, like why we're doing them, why we went from using this at an individual level to trying to move it into the community level. I also wanted to give you an overview of what the readiness assessments are and how to do them. And then I just want to remind you that all of the details about this can be found in that workbook by the Triethnic Center. They're not the only ones that have a model. There are a number of different models, but again, I always argue that this is the best one because they have the most research on it, and it's the easiest one to adapt to your community. So I'm going to drop a link to the workbook in the chat box. I will also include a PDF of all of these slides that I've just shown you. There's also some slides that I skipped over that I didn't get to. And so if you want to go through and look at those, you can. Also, I'm happy to stay and answer questions if people have questions. But since I'm out of time, I'll stop and turn it back to you, Heidi.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Yeah, does anyone have any questions for Logan? Feel free to unmute and ask away.
I have a quick question. I just want to ask real quick. So on that workbook, did they give examples? I'm guessing they probably do. I feel like this is necessary, but do they give like examples on the kind of questions to ask specifically, or do they expect you to kind of come up with those?
No, I think that's one of the great things about this is that they've already created the questions and they've made them generic enough that all you have to do is insert the specific issue. So they have all of these sample questions and you can just put in underage alcohol consumption or whatever the issue is. And then you also can adjust the ones that are not in bold. So any questions that are not bolded, if you want to reword them
That's
or
right. Okay.
change them up a little bit, you can do that. Did I answer your question,
Yeah.
Jared? Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, I think you kind of touched on a lot of that. I just couldn't remember if that was specifically noted, but yeah, that's great. Awesome.
I did, but I went really fast through that. So I think that's a really good question. They have the questions there. You can just adapt them. And then if you want to add in more, you can.
Okay, thanks.
I have a
Okay.
question, Logan.
Yeah, go ahead, Trudy.
So this is in regards to like selecting your people that you're going to interview. So in
Yeah.
a smaller area, like we have one juvenile probation officer who's on our coalition and one hospital administrator who's on our coalition. And so, because I know you probably don't want people as familiar with all the programs you do on your coalition, but
Yep.
what's your advice on how you kind of get around that?
That's a great question. And if other people have thoughts that they want to chime in on this, I think that would be great. I did want to just reiterate what you said, Trudy, is that you don't want to use coalition members. They know more about this than the average person. So the idea is to reach out to people in the community who may not be involved with the efforts that you're already doing so that you get a better idea of what the community as a whole thinks. And when it comes to your really small communities, keep in mind that that might be when it's appropriate to only have 6 interviewees. Maybe you're only going to do 6 interviews because it's going to be hard to find 12 people that aren't engaged and can represent the general community's take on this. And the other thing that I would say is don't be afraid to get outside of those boxes. So what you've probably done in building your coalition is tried to bring somebody from each of those sectors. And you may have tapped into the only person from that sector. Maybe you only have one church congregation and therefore one religious leader. As you mentioned, maybe you only have one person working with a juvenile detention center. And so I would say don't be afraid to get outside of those. And this can be what you discuss with your coalition and have them give you your feedback. But you might decide, you know what, there's not anybody at the courts that we can get that isn't already very engaged with this. So we're not going to worry about that sector. Think about some other entity in your community that might represent a portion of your community. So maybe you start thinking about social groups or business groups. I was actually working with a coalition in a really small town one time where they had done really good with these. They had been able to I think they actually did 10 interviews every time they did these, but they had been doing them for about 8 years. I think they did them every other year. So they'd done 4 of these and they were starting to exhaust their options because of that. They tried to interview different people every time they conducted the readiness assessments. And after 4 iterations of that, there was just nobody else that they could reach out to in the community from those sectors. So they actually decided to focus in on a specific group. So they decided we're going to target parents. So they involved their PTA and they just picked randomly 6 parents from the community and they did the readiness assessment with just that sector. So I guess what I'm saying is you want to make sure that you're getting interviews from a representative population, which means that you don't want to interview 6 teachers or 6 law enforcement officers if you're trying to get the entire community's perspective. But you may not have to focus on those SAMHSA 12 sectors. Maybe you can think of different groups in the community that might be representative and go with that. Is that helpful at all, Trudy?
Yes, that's great. So you made me think of one other thing, and I hope you didn't already say this and I missed it, but how often, what's the guideline on how often you do your community readiness survey with the same questions so you can measure the level of over time?
There's actually some research on this. So some different researchers using the Tri-Ethnic Centers model have looked at how often you need to do them. And basically their recommendation, and I'm trying to remember because I specifically asked this of one of the researchers at Colorado State because I was interested in their take on it. And they're the ones that pointed me to some of the research on it. And it seems to me like what they said was the research shows that you don't have to do them every year, but you can if you want to. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. They recommended every other year to give you a consistent tracking of where you're at, because communities change significantly enough over time that if you're only doing them every 4 or 5 years, you might be missing a lot of what's happening in the interim. So their recommendation was to do them every 2 years. It was because of that recommendation that that's what got put into the requirements for the opioid settlement dollars. So if we're doing readiness assessments on opioids in order to get some of that funding, we need to be doing them every 2 years. I believe, I don't know if we have anybody from the state office online, but I think that the division directives also require every 2 years that they're done. It's every 2 or 3 years.
Okay, I have a question.
Yeah.
So using the community readiness model from Colorado State, what is the cost on that?
It's a great question. I'm glad you asked that because I should have been clear about this and I didn't even mention it. It is completely free. So they have developed this under the academic domain. They created a website at the university where they have posted this workbook. So you can just go on and download that for free. I put the link in the chat box. So if you click on that link, it'll take you straight to the workbook. But you can also go to their webpage and they talk about some of the history behind the survey, and they have some other information about it, but it's all free. There is no cost to get that workbook. And then you can have your coalition go through and do these and no cost at all.
I like free. Thank you.
Right?
Awesome. Does anyone else have any other questions? Okay, great. Well, thank you guys so much for coming, and thank you to Logan for presenting this important information. We'll make sure to send out the recording for this along with all the resources that Logan shared in the next couple of days through the UPCA email. And if anyone has any ideas for future webinars or anything you're passionate or you need help with, please let us know, and we'll see you again next month. Thanks, everyone.